Joining me today is Tribal Chief Tyrone McNeil. Tyrone is Stalo and a member of the Seabird Island Band. He has extensive experience working to advance First Nations languages, education, collaborating with First Nations across the country, and developing agreements and partnerships with the government. He holds numerous leadership positions, listeners. He is Vice President and Tribal Chief of the Stalo Tribal Council. He's the President of the First Nations Education Steering Committee, the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs Committee on Education. He's the representative from British Columbia, the chair of the Emergency Planning Secretariat, chair of Seabird College, president of Seabird Development Corporation, and the standing chair of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So clearly, listeners, you know exactly where this conversation is going today. Tyrone, you have an incredible number of titles and leadership positions. I want to welcome you to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Looking forward to our conversation. I'm glad we could make this happen. Now, before we dig into our conversation, which is clearly going to focus in on the education of our Indigenous youth here in British Columbia and across Canada and quite literally around the world, I do want listeners to have a little bit more about your background. So before we dig into the substance of that conversation, let's talk a little bit about you. Maybe talk about your background professionally. What is your background? And why the gravitation toward education? Why so much involvement in the education field?
Professionally, out of all the hats I wear, Tom, I think that the only one that'll approach the professional side is manager of a First Nations owned civil construction company. That's really my paying day job. We have about 80 employees, the majority are First Nations. We have non-First Nations, which is fine, but we're about First Nations, right? And
Right.
we've transitioned over the years from job creation to career development. And by career development, I mean stable, high-paying jobs. I got a number of my crew are actually building houses, paying for it out of their pocket, Tom. Not a low subsidy housing, but paying a mortgage out of their pocket. So it is
Right.
really about career development.
Mm-hmm. So so that's your day job, and that's what pays the bills
Mm.
and supports your family. But you have such a heavy involvement in education. So what drew you to, again, being, we're going to talk about Finesk in a moment,
Mm.
but just your involvement with education. Where did that sort of stem from?
It started specifically in 1999, Tom. I got elected onto the Seabirds Band Council, and we've had a very stable governance right from the get-go. So in that election, I was the only new member elected into 8 council members and a chief.
Mm-hmm.
And this is 1999, and back then, folks didn't necessarily look at education as a priority. There's so many other priorities that chiefs and council are responsible for.
Right.
So it just so happens that the rookie on council got this thing called an education portfolio. And although I was aware of education, partly involved and whatnot, I wasn't aware of what was all involved. So taking it on as a portfolio, being in our school here in Seabird on nearly a daily basis, the public schools, the school board office, and it just sparked a passion in me, Tom. I seen it as the number one vehicle for moving and transitioning our entire population from a population based on dependency from the Indian Act to empowerment to self-determination. And we can't advance ourselves professionally, career-wise, financially with better paying jobs if we don't have a better education, a higher education. So literally, right from day one on a job as education portfolio, it bit me really deep, Tom. And
Yeah,
then
it really.
over time, I found as more and more people were like-minded and engaging in some really powerful conversations. So I just found myself to be, although I was new to it, a really good fit, and I still enjoy it here in 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that as educators as well, we know that that foundation for children and adolescents and youth as they grow into adulthood, that foundation of education really is the key to success and a lifelong of success. Let's talk a little bit again, just to give listeners, be listeners from British Columbia will know the First Nations Education Steering Committee, or FNESC. But for listeners who are outside of British Columbia or even outside of Canada, can you just give us an overview of what is FNESC and what is the mission of that organization?
The FNESC is a First Nations technical organization working with and supporting, and in some cases representing and advocating for the 203 First Nation communities here in the province. And within those communities, we've got 130 schools on reserve, mostly primary, about 30 go up to grade 12. We've got 37 post-secondary institutes on reserve that we work with, support, and advocate for as well.
Mhm.
So we've got a political, although we're technical, we do have a political protocol. In BC, where First Nations are really well versed in finding ways to come together in key areas like education, child welfare, forestry, mining, whatnot. So in that are three political bodies: the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the First Nations Summit, and the BC Assembly of First Nations. Their executive comes together and are known as the First Nations Leadership Council. That's our most senior First Nations leadership in the province, and we have a protocol with them, like others do. But in our case, our protocol states that we're the lead advocacy body for First Nations lifelong learning here in British Columbia.
Mhm. So let's pivot now and talk about the education of Indigenous youth and children, and talk about some specifics. Now we're going to get to the other side of this coin momentarily, but I want to begin with what currently has you feeling the proudest in terms of what's happened so far, or what has you feeling the most optimistic going forward about how Indigenous children and youth in BC are being educated and how they're being supported. What has you sort of really feeling positive at this point?
One of the things make me feel positive and comes back to the organization's mission and mandate and whatnot around starting with Indian control of Indian education, parental involvement, local control, and whatnot. We've wrapped that up into a really comprehensive tripartite agreement between Finesse, British Columbia, and Canada called the BC Tripartite Education Agreement. In there, we're really explicit on the flow of funding in key program areas. A big chunk of that funding comes to us as an organization, and we work with communities on a methodology for distributing throughout the province, whether they're school-based, community-based, institute-based.
Mhm.
And what we're doing in such a coordinated fashion, it's virtually seamless, Tom. I've got 130 board members, and we get together quarterly. We have stacked agendas, 4 inches binders of information, and we find ways to be on the same page on virtually every issue that comes before us, whether
Mhm.
it's something we're new and starting off from scratch, or ultimately the provincial or federal government might be posing something we don't agree with, and we come up with a response to the strategy and that attack that is voted on unanimously, and then we advance it that way. And then directly related to that, Tom, is like the moving of the agenda for First Nations education here in BC. I was just attended a BC School Trustees AG8 last month, and that they, as an organization, as a major stakeholder in education here in BC, they've shifted considerably over the
Mhm.
last 8 years, Tom. I
Mhm.
can remember being invited to their AGA in 2016, and the first words out of my mouth in a room full of trustees and superintendents and ministry officials, Tom, is some of you here in this room are racist.
Mhm.
And a number of them were right. And after I finished talking, a number came up to me, thanked me for identifying the elephant in the room. So we being the BC School Trustees Association, Tom, have moved from me making that comment in 2016 to being invited to the AGA last month, where they spent 2 full days with First Nations elders doing some cross-cultural training and sharing with a room full of trustees that were fully attentive, fully engaged, and fully appreciative of being educated like that. So
Mhm.
that's a major shift in the system, right? And the trustees are a big piece of the education system. We need more other stakeholders embracing us like that too. But that's really something to celebrate, Tom. When you
Yeah.
have a room full of trustees being happy to be educated by First Nations elders for 2 days, it's amazing.
Wow, that is amazing. Two things I want to follow up with in your answer there. First, um, let's start with one of the first things you said. Everybody being on the same page is almost unheard of in any situation or any circumstance. How did that happen? How did where did you find your way to that level of alignment within the organizations that are trying to work together?
But we find, in my case, it's education, but it applies to other sectors as well, where we're all under certain pressures, whether we're not receiving the funding required to do what we're doing, or there's
Mhm.
policies and policy frameworks that don't recognize us or lack our worldview. So we come from a pretty standard position of oppression, right? So
Hmm.
for education, it was a lack of funding from federal government. They wouldn't fund us comparably to the provincial government. The Ministry of Education and school boards making decisions that didn't include us. That was standard right across the province, right?
Right.
So when we met together, we talked about, okay, we're tired of being treated that way. How do we want to change it? And we've got some excellent staff, Tom. I got a great team of staff supporting me,
Hmm.
and particularly my executive director, Deb Jeffrey. And we have a number of staff like here where they were teachers in the past, they're trustees in the past, they're lawyers, they're well-rounded folks, citizens, and they're here working for me within the organization. So,
Hmm.
what an issue is before us, and staff get together, frame out some suggested responses or options, bring it up to the board level, have dialogue, like everybody's included, Tom.
Yeah.
And quite often we get pressure from provincial and federal government on the amount of money it takes for us to bring a board together. Or we have regional sessions where we've broken the province down to 9 different regions, and we're out there up to 6 times a year in each region talking about local education agreements, curriculum, language and culture, graduation, those kind of things. So
Hmm.
for me in education, the number one reason for us being on the same page is we're so inclusive. A
Hmm.
130 member board is pretty representative of the province. We get out into the regions, into communities on a regular basis to hear from, and I'm never surprised, Tom, at the excellent suggestions that come from the ground. Those folks were literally on the ground and in classrooms that we wouldn't even have thought of, but we raise something with them, they respond that way, and then we have the ability to raise that to be our province-wide mandate in that area. So it's that inclusivity, the flexibility, the communications that allows us to be on the same page.
Yeah, I love that. The one other follow up to what you were saying there, and maybe if you would just very briefly for listeners outside of British Columbia, when I travel around the United States and Canada and other places, and I talk about some of the structures we have in place, and I don't mean to suggest they are by in any means perfect, but when I describe for them the enhancement agreements, the memorandums of understanding we have within school districts, could you describe that for listeners outside of BC? Help them understand some of the structures that have been put in place, the enhancement agreements, as I say, the memos of understanding, the things that exist to support Indigenous learners, whether they be on reserve or whether they be in a public school system. Could you give us a brief description of that so people understand a little bit of what you've been referring to?
Sure, and that's actually a big piece of the work that we do in the backgrounds, Tom,
Right.
where depending on the relation a local First Nation has with a school district, and a school district could have 1, 2, 15, 20 different First Nations communities within the school district bounds,
Mhm.
that they if the relation is lacking, typically you have an enhancement agreement, something just to set the table to develop a relationship.
One of the duties I had in Penticton was around Indigenous education and the fascinating work with the enhancement agreements and the layers of understanding. It was definitely a steep learning curve in that. Now, I want to go back to one more thing you said, Tyrone. I'm trying to envision you in 2016 standing in the middle of a meeting of provincial trustees and making this assertion. And can you walk me through what the next few hours or the next few days of that kind of looked like? I can imagine the types of reactions you must have had in the room when you stand up and you say all of you or most of you in this room are racist. How did you navigate? How did the group navigate through those hours or those couple of days when you were together? Just maybe give us some insight as to how that played out. That obviously was a breakthrough in relations. We had to shock the system a little bit, didn't you?
Yep,
So
yep.
let's go ahead and walk us through that.
Well, to be clear to begin with, my statement is some of you in this room
Some
are
of you,
racist.
okay,
Yep,
okay, fair enough.
because we know and the ministry knows that there's some school districts within the province that they put it nicely, Tom. They challenge us. The First Nations graduation rate in some districts is as low as 12%, and that's not acceptable. And
No,
to be completely disregarded like that is nothing but racist.
right.
So keep in mind that the trustees AGA was in alignment with my provincial education conference, where we bring 1,000 people together every year and talk
Mhm.
about the priorities in education. So just because we're I, like it, I was it takes a lot to get me to say that in front of a group like that, Tom. And but
Yeah,
it shows you our relation with some school boards at the time. So
right,
I signaled back to my team, I'm going to hang out here for a little while because I can't just say that and walk out, right? So
right.
I sat there for a couple of hours, and a large number of trustees came up to me and just thanked me for putting the elephant on the room. They know it, they see it amongst their peers across the province, but
Hmm.
as an association, they really can't do anything. They can't penalize or scold a board or anything like that.
Right.
But just the fact that they owned it. Nobody said I'm a liar, it's not true or anything like that.
Hmm.
But I think they as an association struggled with how do we manage that as an association? So kudos on the executive leadership of the trustees. They really owned it. They did their own work to transition them as an organization from me making that statement to spending 2 days with their elders. So really, it was the executive leadership of the organization that I thank and recognize for
Hmm.
that, Tom. Because
Yeah,
there are a lot of trustees throughout the province and a lot of folks with different thoughts, different mindsets. So a lot of them are wide open and accepting of us, and some are closed and not accepting of us. But
right.
the executive leadership took the appropriate role and took the association to a much better place. And I know it wouldn't have been easy. Their internal discussion would have been a lot more open, I'm sure, than a public meeting, but they did it, and I really appreciate it for that hard work.
For me, that is the epitome of speaking truth to power, and obviously it paid dividends in terms of the work that's happened since then. And leadership requires courage, and Tyrone, clearly you were showing tremendous leadership in that moment. Now let's go to the flip side. We know that we have in BC made tremendous strides in terms of how we support Indigenous learners, but by no means is it perfect. So what still has you feeling a little bit frustrated, or dare I say, pessimistic about some things in the way that we, and I don't know that you're feeling that, but what is it that you're still feeling frustrated about in terms of how we support Indigenous learners here in BC?
That definitely concerns about Indigenous learners, Tom, but also about the larger education system itself.
Okay, fair enough.
It was around 2015 when public post-secondary institutes came up to us in one of the regular meetings that we had with them, and they informed us that 92% of all BC Dogwood graduates, that's not just us, that's all Dogwood graduates, are
Mhm.
illiterate to step into post-secondary studies. So they, as
Wow.
post-secondary institutes, have to bring up the students' literacy levels to take on certain degrees and programming, whatnot. So that it makes me really nervous, Tom.
Mhm.
And if you think as a system, the struggling there a bit is a nice way to put it, I'd say that we're always on the bottom end of every socioeconomic indicator. So if the system is feeling that pain, it's compounded on us.
Right.
So it just needs a added attention, more light shed on our students, whether it be the success of our students or the lack of success of our students.
Mhm.
But what does keep me going there, Tom, is that we know school boards are trying hard and they're doing new and innovative things, and they're leading to really good success rates for our kids. They're being courageous themselves, Tom. Like I was on a call this morning with the Indigenous district leads throughout the province here. A number of them were sharing how they, as a district, taking it on themselves to not offer English 10, for example.
Mhm.
Because years ago we worked with the province and we came up with an English First Peoples 10 that's
Mhm.
academically equivalent to English 10. But it's based on our literature, our worldview, our authors and whatnot. So if you want to graduate in that district, your grade 10 English is about us. So it's
Mhm.
those incremental steps like that we need to recognize more that good work taking place in the province and use that as a demonstration that it can be done with a willing partner to encourage those boards that are historically a little bit less willing.
Yeah, the First Peoples curriculum to me was a tremendous breakthrough here in British Columbia, and really just it was almost a hitting the reset button about what is quality literature, what is language, how do we teach it, how do we teach it through, uh, you know, uh, how do we create opportunities for not just Indigenous learners, but for non Indigenous learners to have the opportunity to learn through language and culture within English First Peoples too, which is also a byproduct of that course. So I absolutely loved that. Now, Tyrone, I think I would be derelict in my duties here if we did not talk about, from an education perspective, we did not talk about residential schools and the residential school issue. And of course, it was just over a year ago in May of 2021 when the remains of 215 children were found in Kamloops at the site of a former residential school. And I think we all know that this is not going to be the last time a discovery like this is made. I know there is no way to truly sort of get over or move past the legacy of residential schools in Canada. The intergenerational effects alone will never truly be reconciled. And I'm not even sure I really have a question here, and I'm trying to ask this artfully, as artfully as I can. I'm thinking about the pathway forward. Knowing that what happened in Kamloops last year was not a one-off, how do we, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, grapple with the horrors of the past as we try to find our way forward in coming to terms? Because we know, as I said, what happened last year is likely to repeat itself. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how do we together grapple with the horrors of the past?
There's a few things happening since Kamloops became public, Tom. One is a more of awareness by British Columbians, sorry, Canadians, of what actually happened in residential schools. Because
Mhm.
a lot of British Columbians, a lot of Canadians that I talked to over the years think we're lying when we're talking about the atrocities in residential schools. But now, when they're hearing on the news that there's bodies of children, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years old, being
Yeah.
found in unmarked graves, it's really hitting them hard in the hearts, Tom. It's opening up their hearts in ways that we never could in the past. Um, and it absolutely relate to that because children of any race are important, right? They're valued, they're loved and whatnot. And I think it's taking that to have a lot of British Columbians, a lot of Canadians kind of step back a little bit and start looking. Oh, gee, now I kind of get why you see so many First Nations on skid rows in cities and whatnot. So impoverished First Nations across the country and whatnot. It's a history that was imposed on us. It wasn't
Yeah.
optional, it was imposed. So Canadians are just now starting to understand that. And we'd like to leverage that passion to make inroads in more awareness. In BC, we worked with the province and education stakeholders. We've come up with Indian residential school curriculum and that could be taught in public schools. We've come up with teacher resource guides for teachers that don't know us, but they need a little bit of support to be able to teach curriculum on residential schools. But the uptake on it over the years is pretty low, Tom, or not as
Yeah.
high as we'd like. So now I'm really hoping that with more of this awareness out there, more teachers would go, gee, maybe I should learn more about this. And gee, maybe I should be teaching my students about it as well because that it's that education aspect of it that all we ask for is a level playing field because right now it's not level for us. We're looked down on and with zero understanding of why we're at the bottom end of so many socioeconomic indicators. So on one regard it's really softened the approach of many British Columbians, many of those in the education system and other systems as well. So as sad and as it's hard to respond to unmarked graves being discovered like that, Tom. And as a leader, as a father, as a grandfather, but just all we can do is step back, is send our prayers that way, and hope communities like Kamloops and come to grips with it and do what they need to finally process it themselves. But what I'm worried about, Tom, is as hard as that is mentally and spiritually and physically on us and a lot of other British Columbians and Canadians, this is compounded on top of 2 years of COVID. So that added mental stress, that added mental harm that every one of us have been going through and not being able to meet with their family and friends on a regular basis, it is getting better now, but we have a ways to go to rekindle those relations.
Mhm.
So when folks are asking, what could we learn from, what could we do as a result of Kamloops, and all I could say is, be compassionate, feel empathy towards us, but be willing to work with us.
Yeah.
And knowing that we're not going to use that as a crutch or a sledgehammer, it's just our reality, Tom. It's a really sad, hard pill to swallow reality, but help us overcome it. Coming back to education, in my view, is the best vehicle to overcome that. So let's continue to make some significant changes in education, not only to support the successes and academic achievements of our kids, but continue educating British Columbians and Canadians on that history in the appropriate way. It's not a crutch, it's not a sledgehammer, but it's a reality. And I feel really strongly, Tom, that when we do that in an effective, productive way, it's going to take away a lot of this indifference, bias, and racism that British Columbians and Canadians feel against First Nations. It's so natural in the Canadian fabric to be indifferent or racist towards us. Well,
Yeah.
now is an opportunity. Let's overcome that for the betterment of First Nations, the betterment of Canadians, and for the betterment of us as a country as a whole.
Do you think it the denial, the defensiveness, et cetera? Do you think it is? And I know I can't cast everyone as a monolith in one group, but do you think it is that British Columbians, Canadians take the assertions too personally? In that the things that have happened in the past and the assertions about racism and the atrocities of residential schools, is it that Canadians in modern society are taking that too personally and taking it as an individual affront rather than seeing it as a systemic thing? Is that where part from your perspective, is that where part of the challenge is coming from?
I think what you're describing as a challenge, Tom, is become more in the public domain over the last 20 years, particularly via social media.
Right.
If you go back to the 1990s and prior to that, Canadians would have no idea we even existed. It's
Right.
like a lot of school boards wouldn't even know which First Nations are within their districts and whatnot. And we was being seen as nothing but wards of the state.
Yeah.
And the Indian Act makes us that, right? It
Right.
impoverishes us. It puts us in a position that disempowers us, that we have to go to the federal government for anything and everything. And just think, Tom, it was only about 60 years ago where our leadership of the day, our chiefs and councils, couldn't make a decision without an Indian agent's signature to a decision. So
Right.
that paternalistic and that's not that long ago, yet we've come so far since. So
Right.
it's been a struggle, and we've had willing partners in the education system right from the early days as well, but there hasn't been enough of them. There
Right.
hasn't been
Well.
enough understanding by the general public, and you see it play out in trustee elections, where trustees tend to be pretty demonstrative of the population within the school district.
Right.
And if the
Right.
population within a school district don't know about us, they're ignorant about us, or they're indifferent or biased, the trustees are going to be that very thing, Tom. So
Right.
the more awareness out there, that I think over time, that you'll see a shift in some of the school boards that have been such a problem for generations, that their eyes open a little bit differently tomorrow. They start thinking a little bit differently. They feel some empathy and they're willing to do a little bit more for us. Not do everything for us, but do more things with us.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty significant.
Yeah. To advocate for the changes that are necessary. Certainly, uh, I think it's very true. We have come a long way, but at the same time, we have a long way to go in terms of what's needed. So, with advocacy, I want to shift back to thinking about the future. With any kind of advocacy, there's always a set of goals or a desirable outcome. So, as you think about the education of Indigenous children and youth in British Columbia, what is the desirable or ultimate what is the vision for you from your perspective? I know that there are many voices and many people have slightly different perspectives, and I know you don't speak for everybody, but from your perspective, you know what would have you saying we finally did it, like we finally have, even if it's a pipe dream, like what is that desirable outcome? This is how our Indigenous children and youth should have been educated all along. What would have you saying that? What's the vision?
For me, what I see at the I don't want to say end of the tunnel, Tom, but what I see down the road is our education outcomes continue to improve, that we're graduating at least the same as the rest of British Columbians, if not better, that
Hmm.
then we're advancing into professional positions where we have more of our teachers in classrooms, or more of our principals, superintendents, and whatnot, special needs teachers, the professionals in the system. But
Right.
beyond that, we're engaged in civic elections. We're participating directly in local governments. Where more of us are elected in the provincial governments and whatnot. So
Hmm.
we're incorporated more in the British Columbia society writ large.
Hmm.
And to do that, we need a really well-educated population. So that's really what I see in my mind, Tom. And there's a lot of things that other successes along the way, whether they be improved employment rates and improving the wages of those that are employed, going on to professional careers and whatnot. Knowing it's not for everybody, but those that seek trades, there's more journeyman trades out there doing really good work, and they're really happy in their careers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, for me, when I look out there and see people working, I really look for the people that are passionate about what they're doing. They enjoy what they're doing. So it's
Hmm.
not all about the highest wages, Tom. It's about building skills to allow people to enjoy what they're passionate about, at whatever that might be, at any level. And that's what success is for me, Thomas, when we're meeting the learning needs of individuals. Well, we're not talking about a stat for the 7,500 First Nations in public schools or the 5,000 in our schools. We're talking about individual successes. And it takes a lot of work to get there, but it's
For
so
sure.
rewarding when we see those smiling faces that, people enjoy what they're doing. It's not a job, but they happen to get paid for it. They love it. That,
They love
that,
it.
that would be ideal for me, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that would be a tremendous accomplishment, and certainly something worth striving for and advocating for, and making sure that all of our learners, Indigenous learners, are set up for success, a life of success, financial security, passion for the work they're following and leading, and all of that. Just absolutely would be a tremendous accomplishment for sure. So let's finish up by widening our view a little bit. I want you to, because I know, Tyrone, that you have interactions with other organizations across Canada and maybe into the United States and around the world. I'm not sure. We know that political boundaries are a sort of Eurocentric idea, and we know that nations cross borders all the time.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about when you look across Canada or you look into the United States and you think about another model or another jurisdiction, how they are supporting Indigenous learners, Indigenous education. Is there anything that you see across Canada or into the United States that you're maybe a little envious of, or you think we should replicate that, or that's something we should do here in British Columbia? Is there a model out there, or is there an aspect of that model out there that you think would be really helpful here in British Columbia?
They First of all, the model we built here in BC, we've looked at other jurisdictions, we've learned from them, we've borrowed from them, we invited them here to present to us on it. So the one of the uniquenesses about our model here in BC is we've got the systems model in place, we've got the
Hmm.
structures model in place,
Yeah.
but we wouldn't advance it without an appropriate funding methodology to support it.
Hmm.
So when I look at other models across Canada, I see some really good structures, some really good systems, but they don't have the necessary funding to do what's intended in their agreement. So
Hmm.
we and not to put down anybody, it's just their strategy, their tactic. Well, this is ours.
Okay.
On the K to 12 side, I want to be careful how I say this, Tom, but a lot of people tell us that we're the organization for First Nations education
Hmm.
and in Canada. But on the post-secondary side, in particular, what some of our counterparts and the United States are doing is just tremendous. Where they've got their own accredited post-secondary institutes with thousands of students putting on all kinds of degree programs. And mind you, one of their communities might be, 15,000 citizens alone, whereas in BC, and it's one of our number one challenges, Tom. So many of our communities are so small.
Right.
So that compels us to come together and aggregate and build out from there. So from that, it'd be ideal to take a U.S. tribes model and start talking about that here. And we are at the early stages of building a made in BC for BC First Nations post-secondary model, and
Hmm.
we'll be definitely be looking at models such as that. And then one of the areas that we have to roll up our sleeves and do more work on is on the early childhood development, early childhood education aspect of things, Tom. Particularly
Mhm,
now with the Ministry of Education taking over the authority for those early years.
mhm.
Now we have to, cast our web out. What are other jurisdictions doing around early childhood, knowing that there's a play-based aspect to it and an early years education aspect to it, and they're two important factors. Not one can't trump the other or usurp the other. There's room and space for both, and in my experience, Tom, that compels me to talk to folks about a hybrid model or transitioning those early years into grade one in particular.
Yeah.
Where if you're talking about early years program and early childhood educators who aren't certified teachers, or talking to certified teachers in kindergarten that aren't early childhood education teachers, we need a hybrid teacher certification that takes the best of those and best positions children to step into grade one at a grade one or higher level and hit the ground running.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I was not aware of the post-secondary institutions in the United States. It sounds like there's some cross-country conversations where I was kind of hoping you would say that about BC's model, because I do know that BC is often looked to, but I just wondered about other jurisdictions. But it sounds like for K-12 education, in terms of including the funding, that BC may be the model to look to. But the cross conversation about post-secondary, but you're right to point out the population issue. I think that's something that Canada itself deals with, which is having such a much smaller
Mhm.
population. Therefore, the institutions just can't sustain themselves. But a question about that is there. Are there agreements? Because we know that when students from Canada attend United States universities, there is an international tuition that is charged to those students. But I'm wondering, is that something that is the same if an Indigenous learner from Canada wanted to attend an Indigenous university in the United States? Is there a different kind of agreement financially, or is there a way that students can attend those schools in the United States without having to face the same sort of international kinds of fees or tuition? I admit to being ignorant about the topic, so I'd be interested and curious to know how that sort of plays out.
Well, we've got a number of our students attending post-secondary institutes internationally, Tom, whether it's the
Okay.
United States, Britain, France, Italy, like that. Sometimes I'm shocked. Even one of my members here from Seabird gets a degree out of the university in Italy, and they show up at our community awards. We don't even
Hmm.
recognize them because we haven't seen them for years, but they found a way to do it.
Yeah.
And a piece of it is our ability to financially support them. We do have
Okay.
limited funds.
Yeah.
It'll be a community's choice. Do they fund a student to go to an institute in the United States or even Alberta or Ontario
Mm-hmm.
or London, for example? So a piece of that is the local community's priority and their ability to move funds
Right.
around. And see, that's the reason we're building a post-secondary model here, because right now we do know our system is underfunded, that
Hmm.
communities have to cherry pick who to support and who they don't have enough resources to support. And many of those same communities are finding their own revenue, own source revenue, and putting that towards post-secondary studies as well.
Hmm.
So it's safe to say that we don't necessarily have the same barriers of other British Columbians or Canadians in attending those international institutes, but it ends up being a financial burden, and whether we have the ability to support them
Right.
financially or not. And then at
Right.
the same time, those students are working one and two jobs to get their own money to pay for the fees
Right.
and room and board and whatnot as well. So it's not like they're relying totally on our post-secondary funding. They're doing what
Mhm.
they can as well.
Yeah, for sure. So wonderful, Tyrone. This has been a fascinating conversation, and certainly I know that I'm going to listen back to this myself several times. I really appreciate it. So let's two questions left. Let's finish up here as we close out. These are two questions, Tyrone. I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. They're two general questions. You can take them in any direction you want to. The first question, again, take it where you want. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
In terms of education, it's about never giving up.
Hmm.
Never be too frustrated, never be too angry, never take too hard a line, or at least limit the hard lines, because occasionally we do. So in that regard, what keeps me up at night sometimes is who's across the table that might be preventing us from advancing, preventing us from improving the outcomes of our students, and whether it's something as large as a Ministry of Education, or you do go down a layer to school boards. And it's actually that relation between the Ministry of Education and school boards that does keep me up at night, Tom,
Hmm. Yeah.
because the ministry is empowered school boards to be, for the most part, autonomous. But I continually tell a ministry, you can delegate any and all authority that you see fit to school boards, except ours. So, ministry, we need you to come in and support us at the school board level when we ask you to, and the school boards need to be open to that. So it's that piece, Tom, that we need to figure out is how do we have the ministry hold school boards trustees accountable in terms of our priorities, that allows us to improve. And really, that's all we're asking for is provisions to improve the outcomes of our kids. So, and I don't necessarily call that a jurisdictional divide or jurisdictional space. It's a delegated authority from the ministry to school boards, and we need to look at that differently. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, Tom, that when we broker whatever that is to better suit our needs, that other British Columbians might look at it and go, geez, we want to be a little more engaged through and have supports from the ministry rather than our local school boards as well. So it might be an opportunity to take a look at the education system and do a little bit of redesigning. A really well thought out, thoughtful, strategic process, but it's that bit of a narrative that I
Yeah.
wake up at 2 at night, and maybe we should try this, or have we tried that kind of thing. That's
That's
mhm.
understandable for sure. That would keep you up at night for sure. That's a big one. Last question as we finish up, Tyrone. Generic question about success. If a random person stopped you on the street and said, "What's your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
My definition of success is seen and felt in all aspects of living here in British Columbia. Whether I'm attending a post-secondary institute or I'm walking into a supermarket or a mall, where right now, if I walk into a store, Tom, chances are somebody gets up and they stay 10 feet behind me for the entire time I'm in that store. That's that racist behavior of the store because they don't know us, right?
Right.
So over time, we've modified the education of everybody here in British Columbia so that they know us better, that racism is diminished. It'll never be completely gone, but diminished. So success is being reflective and being felt like as a part of the British Columbia fabric. And
Mhm.
at the same time, our graduation rates have increased. And I got two grandsons, Tom. They're 5 and 6 years old. They're in the education system, and success for me is for those two boys graduating with dogwoods or better, stepping directly into post-secondary institutes, completing advanced degrees, and in that whole education life for them, they see themselves reflected in the education curriculum. They see themselves reflected in instructors that are in front of the classrooms, and if they feel welcomed and warmly by their peers, because their peers know who they are as two young Stalo boys right now, growing up wanting to advance themselves. So, and I don't want to call it holistic necessarily, Tom, but it kind of relates to that, where it's a broad welcoming by this education system itself, being reflected in the curriculum, being taught by culturally appropriate teachers and instructors along the way. And that's what success for me. And it is at that personal level because I love my boys, Tom, and I want nothing but for the best for them in the
Yeah.
future.
Absolutely. That would be the epitome of success for sure. Listeners, you can follow Tyrone on Twitter. The handle is at STC Ty, so STCTYE. And Tyrone is also on LinkedIn. I'll have links in the show notes for both of those accounts so you can connect with Tyrone. Tyrone, this was a fantastic conversation today. I really, really appreciate you doing this. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.